Hello, welcome to part 5 of our video over the Unraveling. Uh, in this video, we're going to talk about what's happening in politics, especially Jimmy Carter's presidency beginning in the 1970s. So, in our last video talking about politics and stuff, we discussed Richard Nixon, right? How Richard Nixon was par- adding over to this unraveling, right? That after Watergate, Nixon starts to resign before it went to court. And then Gerald Ford, Nixon's vice president, becomes the next president of the United States and offers Nixon a full presidential pardon in 1976, which in turn hurt his chances for being elected again. The American people were like, really, you're going to just let him off the hook for breaking the law? And Gerald Ford's like, yeah, which definitely hurt his ability to run for president. So a lot of people lost faith in Ford and the Republican Party in 1976. Americans turned to the former one-term Georgia governor, Jimmy Carter, who was a nuclear physicist and a peanut farmer in Georgia. So he was basically as Georgia as it gets. That's why across Georgia you always see like Jimmy Carter Boulevard, all that good stuff. Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. I think he may have been the only Georgia person from Georgia ever to become president of the United States. So anyway, the Jimmy Carter was very popular. He represented a rising generation of younger, radically liberal Democrats in the New South and captured the Democratic nomination. So Carter became president, and when Carter took the oath of office on January 20th, 1977, he inherited office that was in turmoil. We had urban riots, an economic crisis because of the oil embargo and other things. We also have deindustrialization, talking about what we discussed in the last video with the Rust Belt. Also, we have unemployment, we have poverty, and we have low wages. So basically, Carter inherited a presidency that was in a country that was in turmoil, in a mess, and he had to deal with fixing that. So the nation was a mess when Carter became president, and many of these things were put in motion well before he even took the office. So it wasn't entirely his fault, but as we'll see, how he responded to these things probably wasn't the best thing. Like I mentioned in the last video, the U.S. after World War II helped to rebuild Western Europe and Japan by the 70s. But by the 70s, these nations became the US's main economic rivals, especially West Germany and Japan, who had their auto industries really booming at this point. Um, Also, companies figured out that it was cheaper to produce goods or buy cheap goods from other countries like Taiwan. Um, and tons of goods started in the 70s, started to have labels of like made in Taiwan. Now today we have most of our labels saying like made in China and stuff, but this 1970 period is where American industry started to leave the United States, and in turn that led to a lot of unemployment. Um, so anyway, Carter inherited a government going through an economic recession with staggering unemployment and inflation, as factory jobs started to move outside the United States. Uh, as the result, Carter, like Ford before him, faced an unimagined economic dilemma, um, which was a simultaneous onset of inflation, which inflation, is the overproduction of money where it devalues the currency. So inflation was happening in the 1970s, but also economic stagnation. So the economy wasn't increasing, but it was definitely decreasing. And a combination of this popularized the term stagflation, right? A stagnant economy with an inflating currency. So Carter had to deal with stagflation. So uh, usually when there's an economic crisis, it's one issue or another, inflation or the economy is in trouble. But in Carter's case, he had to deal with both at the same time. On top of that, due to foreign competition of firms and financial institutions, many companies started to buy from Mexico, Taiwan, China, Japan, Brazil, elsewhere because it allowed Americans to buy cheaper products than what was produced in the United States, which is definitely an economic problem that continues to exist in America today. But anyway, Carter failed to slow the unraveling of the American economy, and the stubborn and confounding rise of both unemployment and inflation damaged his presidency and his popularity. So now Carter's presidency was, you know, in senses of the economy and stuff, he wasn't doing great in that. He wasn't really helping out in that aspect, but, what could be done at that point either. Um, but Carter then decided to shift his focus for his presidency to more a humanitarian, right? He became more of a humanitarian and pushed his humanitarian goals. And he even won the Nobel Peace Prize too. So his humanitarian efforts was, one of the good parts of his presidency. In terms of foreign diplomacy, in 1977, Carter decided to do a new approach to the Cold War and proclaimed that the U.S. should no longer base how it functions off of fear of communism and continue to practice the policy of détente that Richard Nixon did with other foreign countries, to work with your enemies, right, and make them your friends instead of competing with them. So he promoted that, and Carter's human rights policy achieved real victories. The United States either reduced or eliminated its aid to support right-wing dictators guilty of extreme human rights abuses, like in South Korea, Argentina, and the Philippines. And in September 1977, Carter negotiated the return of the Panama Canal to Panama, which cost him an enormous political capital. But that's something good that Carter did, right? He gave back the Panama Canal, which we really took from the Panamanians. Think about our earlier lecture, and he gave it back to them. So that's something that was nice that he did. Um, a year later, in September of 1798, Carter negotiated a peace treaty between the Israeli prime minister and the Egyptian president as well. So for the first time, a Middle Eastern Muslim country made peace with the Jewish Israeli state, which was a huge achievement for the time, especially after all the wars between Israel and these Middle Eastern countries that took place after World War II. This became known as the Camp David Accords, where he secured this peace between Israel and Egypt. So this was a pretty big deal, and so he helped to ensure peace. He took away some support to dictators, and he gave back the Panama Canal. So those are just some of the humanitarian efforts they did. But yet Carter's dream of human rights based in foreign policy crumbled before the Cold War, and realities of American politics started to set in. The United States continued to provide military and financial support to dictators all across the world, and in the interest of American interests, right? And because of this, the United States helped to put in place the dictator in Iran. It's called the Shah. So the U.S. put a dictator in Iran called the Shah, and on November of 1979, when the Shah was deposed by Iranian revolutionaries, the revolutionaries then proceeded to go to the American embassy in Iran, and it's there in Tehran where these Iranian revolutionaries took 52 Americans hostage. So this led to the Iran hostage crisis of 1979. And this start and just put a huge black spot on Carter's presidency. The Carter administration was humiliated and overwhelmed during this hostage crisis, and that really didn't make things better for him. And it would take years for this hostage crisis to be sorted out, right? And while these Americans, these over 50 Americans, were held prisoner in this new Iranian government. So also past that, in 1980, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which the U.S. Didn't have a great response to that either. Um, and also, Carter made several attempts to pass nuclear arms reductions in the Soviet Union. Um, so he tried to reduce the number of nuclear arms the United States and the Soviet Union had. But Republicans like Ronald Reagan, who we'll talk about next week, really criticized Carter for doing this. Um, so Jimmy Carter, he tried his best during his term in office, but he was faced with a nation already unraveling when he took the office. He was faced with an economic crisis, a hostage situation, and the issue of the Cold War. Now he tried to do his best in terms of human rights and that stuff, but for the most part, Carter was seen as a very unpopular president, um, and he ended up losing his reelection campaign to Ronald Reagan. Um, so the 70s, as we've seen throughout this week, is a major transitional moment in U.S. history, which made many Americans question the country's place in the world and how the country should function. This goes along with all the social and cultural movements taking place in terms of race and gender at this time, which represented how much of American society had unraveled by the 1970s. All right, so that's all I have for you in this video. Please check the syllabus for any upcoming assignments for this weekend. In our next video, we're going to talk about Ronald Reagan's presidency going into the 80s and how this became another turning point for American history. All right, if you haven't seen the other parts of this video, please watch all of those. And I hope you have a good weekend.